this evening. There you go. We are recording the lecture this evening so that if there are those who would like to make sure that friends and family who didn't have an opportunity to be here this evening to be able to see and hear it, they will be able to pick up that recording. I also would ask, as I've asked in the previous weeks, if you're able to and willing to open your camera and your video, it would be great so that we can feel a little bit more intimacy, imagining that we were actually in person. And since it's a smaller group this evening for all of the Dodgers fans who are out there rooting on the Dodgers, we do encourage you to show yourself so that Mr. Eid can see who it is that he's speaking to and engage in dialogue. There are two topics that we're going to be listening to this evening, slightly different than the way it was advertised. The first topic, the major topic, is going to be the accusations that Israel is an apartheid state, and why, in fact, that is not the case, and what it is that we can do with the information that Mr. Eid provides us to help push the argument against Israel as an apartheid state. And then hopefully, if there's time, Mr. Eid is going to talk to us a little bit about the Abraham Accords 2.0. Who's next? Who does he think is possibly the next country in the Middle East that might be willing to join with the three previous countries to be part of the Abraham Accords, and what role, if any, might the Biden administration play in the US to encourage that? For a few minutes while we were talking before we started, Rabbi Golko and I learned that Mr. Eid usually comes to the States about 5 to 7 times a year, often on the behest of either Stand With Us or Camera or university student unions that invite him to speak. And it can be very, very heated in those conversations. And in fact, he has to speak oftentimes with an armed bodyguard or police units in order to make sure that the crowds act appropriately. He's going to be back in the States in the beginning of November, speaking at the University of Berkeley. So we are so very happy that he is in the United States regularly speaking the truth and better helping individuals understand what's really going on in the Mideast. And so we are delighted, Mr. Eid, that you are here with us once again.
Thank you.
To close out our series.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yes, I think that those who are considering or calling or accusing Israel as an apartheid, they are trying, that the apartheid slogan became much more a political slogan rather than it is a practical one. Political slogan means that those who are accusing Israel as an apartheid are trying to pull more and more towards violence and towards hatred towards Israel. That's exactly the agenda of those who are considering or accusing Israel as an apartheid. I want to tell you that I visited South Africa 4 times, and I lectured there over the major universities in South Africa. And I faced face to face those who are calling Israel as an apartheid. Once I came to a group of students who are accusing Israel as an apartheid. And I said, listen, why you hate Israel? And he said, for a very simple reason. Can you tell me the reason, please? He said, yes, Israel was a country who used to support the apartheid regime in South Africa, And Israel used to have a lot of connection with the apartheid regime in South Africa. I said, excuse me, only Israel has such kind of cooperation with the apartheid regime in South Africa? What about Saudi Arabia? What about Europe? Why you are not calling Saudi Arabia as an apartheid? Why you are not calling the EU, the European countries as an apartheid? Why only Israel? Then you know what the answer was? This is what they taught us, that Israel is an apartheid. So those people has no idea what is Israel is, what's going on inside Israel, which kind of relationship between the Palestinians and the Israelis. They have no idea. They never visited Israel. They never saw the facts on the ground inside Israel and what is the relation between the Palestinians and the Israelis. So these people already has a kind of a brainwash, let me say it, that they will continue considering Israel as an apartheid, because this is unfortunately what they are teaching them in the universities in South Africa. I must have to mention to you that I was really shocked to see in some universities Jewish doctors and professors who are teaching in several universities in South Africa, they also considering Israel as an apartheid. They also supporting the BDS movement. That's really shocked me to see is such people calling their own country, their own state as an apartheid, or supporting a kind of a boycott against their own country and their own people. This is one of the major problems, in my opinion. Secondly, I met 4 years ago a group of students in Israel whom arrived from several universities from South Africa. And I took them on a short trip to Ramallah because I want to show them what are the facts on the ground and how the Palestinians' daily life under the Palestinian Authority, because no Israel is in Ramallah area. And I was shocked, you know, that those students, 14 students in number, they told me a very shocking story. And that story has been published when they went back to South Africa in one of the newspapers. What was the story? When those 14 students decided to make a trip to Israel, they have been approached by the BDS movement to impose pressure on them to cancel their trip to Israel. While they refused to cancel the trip, the BDS suggested to them $4,000 each of them in terms to cancel their trip to Israel. Listen well how the BDS is acting here, because the BDS knows very well that if those 14 students will make their trip to Israel, they are going to discover the old lies of the BDS, and they are going to discover that Israel never ever been an apartheid state. That's showing you how the political agenda of those organizations who are accusing Israel as an apartheid, there are a lot of let's say a hidden goals and aims behind their agendas. It's not just calling Israel an apartheid. They want to achieve much more than this by considering Israel as an apartheid. Now, when we come to Israel today, look to the Israeli Arabs. Let us put the Palestinians aside. Let us take the Israeli Arabs. In Israel these days, there are 2 million Israeli Arabs considered as a full citizens of the state of Israel. Those people, in my opinion, are living much better than any other Palestinian living under any Arab country. Look to the Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, what's going on with them. Look to the Palestinian refugees in Syria as an example. This is something unbelievable what is happening over there to the Palestinians in those countries. So those Israeli Arabs, in my opinion, 95% of them already realized and already convinced that their life under Israel is much better than it is under any other Arab country. Unfortunately, we have terrorists among those Israeli Arabs. We have so violent people among those Israeli Arabs. But while we talk about over than 95% who would love to continue living in peace with Israel, I think that that's really very important. And that's showing that Israel never ever been an apartheid state. If you will go to the hospitals these days, you will see heads of departments, Israeli Arabs. Go to the army, a very high rank officers in the Israeli army are an Israeli Arabs. If you will go everywhere in any other governmental office, you will find an Israeli Arabs. So in my opinion, that's a proof that Israel never ever been an apartheid. Let's take the new government recently, which has been created in Israel. The first time that you have not only an Israeli Arab party, but even an Israeli Arab Muslim party, which is led by member of Knesset Mansour Abbas. I think that when Prime Minister Naftali Bennett decided to include the Israeli Arab Party in his government, this is also another proof to the world that Israel never ever been an apartheid. Show me one black served in the apartheid regime in South Africa. Never ever. Go to the buses, go to the train, you will see a religious woman sitting beside a religious Jewish woman. A Muslim man sitting beside a religious Jewish man. People are just looking to each other as people. We know that the Israelis are people who probably the most people on earth who are supporting the Palestinians, who are feeling so good with the Palestinians, who would love to continue working with the Palestinians. So all of those rumors about Israel as an apartheid, in my opinion, it is just a political slogans rather than it is a practical one. I want to suggest to those who believes that Israel is an apartheid to come on a tour to Israel and to see the facts on the ground. You know, when I was in South Africa, I visited the Apartheid Museum for 2 times in Johannesburg. And what I saw in that museum, never ever saw it in my life under the Israelis. You know, I am living under the Israelis almost 45 years. 45 years. I didn't come to Israel yesterday or the day before or last year. 45 years. What is going on in Israel is completely different than the case of South Africa. And this is what I am trying to tell the South African people all the time, that South Africa is not an example, is not a model to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We are completely different conflict than the South Africa conflict. So don't try to compare here, and you must have to open your eyes, to open your ears, and to see and to hear what's really going on these days between the Palestinians and the Israelis. Listen, we are living together over than 48 years, man. We are living together here, and we will continue living together here. I don't think that there is anyone around the world who once will be able to separate the Palestinians from the Israelis. We will continue being together, and we will continue living together in peace and in security. Now, if we will come to our other topic, we have another 5 minutes to talk about it, about the Abraham's Accord and what is the American administration should have to do. I think that the former president of the US, Donald Trump, already put out the lines. And those lines should have to be followed by the current American administration. The current American administration should have to look to the Abraham's Accord as the hollowest accord in the world. And the current American administration should have to continue supporting and pushing some other Arab countries more and more to join the Abraham's Accord. I think that it is possible. I just heard, you know, a week ago that a big Sunni group in Iraq calling for normalization with Israel. That's very important. That's really very important. And as I said all the time, Israel is not the enemy of the Arabs. Israel is not the enemy of the Muslims. Israel only can contribute something which is benefiting those Middle East countries. Those Middle East countries, and mainly the Arab ones, are really need two important things: high tech to increase their economy, and security to increase their security. And Israel is the professional country in the Middle East who can provide these two important issues. So I wish that the American administration will continue pushing towards more and more Arab countries to join the Abraham's Accord. We are not so far, by the way, to see that Saudi Arabia is going to join it. We are not so far to see that Oman in the Gulf is going to join it. We are not so far to see Kuwait in the Gulf one day joining it. I think that this is what reminding me what is the former Israeli president Shimon Peres said that one day we will see a new Middle East. And I think that we are so nearby to see a new Middle East that those Arab countries are much open towards Israel, and Israel only can benefit those countries rather than anything else. So let me probably stop right now and give the audience some time to ask questions and to make things more clear. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Eid. So as I just mentioned in the chat, if you have questions, you can raise your hand. You can put your question in the chat. You can send it to me if you want to remain anonymous. While you are working on those questions, I have a couple of questions just to get us started.
Please.
To the first part of the evening, when you spoke about Israel as an apartheid state, you mentioned that one of the major problems with apartheid in the world is when Jews call Israel an apartheid state. You said that's one of the major problems, and I'm wondering if you can explain a little bit more why you think that. I mean, obviously it's a problem, but why do you think there are Jews themselves who are so willing to say that Israel is an apartheid state? And how is that even more problematic living in the world that we do with Israel as the enemy?
Yeah. See, it's a little bit difficult for me to understand. And as I mentioned, I was surprised to see doctors and professors, Jewish doctors and professors, teaching at the universities in South Africa, considering Israel as an apartheid. That's really shocked me. Secondly, if those doctors or professors considered as a leftist political wing who are more and more interesting to solve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, I don't think that by considering Israel as an apartheid, that will solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Of course not. I think that there are much more better methods and tools to use it in terms to support the solution between the Israelis and the Palestinians. I think that those professors didn't understand or didn't realize that by calling Israel as an apartheid, that's probably create more hatred and more violence towards Israel. That will never bring peace with Israel while you are considering Israel as an apartheid. Excuse me, you are a professor, you are an educated person, you are an academic, you are teaching generations here. You should have to be much more wise when you are talking to those young people about any future conflict or about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's very sad today to come and to consider Israel as an apartheid. Will that really going to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? I don't believe so. I don't believe so. So let us try to find something which is might benefiting the Israelis and the Palestinians in terms to bring for a kind of a justice solution between those people. But I didn't see that we heard, in the past 10 years, people repeating that Israel is an apartheid. Did that really benefited the Palestinians? Did that really benefited the Israelis? Did that really solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? So stop calling it. Stop mentioning it. You try to find another slogan. Might it helps the Israelis and the Palestinians to solve their own conflict.
Thank you. Shanna Meyerson has a question, and then I see afterwards Leslie and Alana, which we'll get to. Shanna's
Please.
question is in the chat. It's an excellent question. She raises the issue about the differences between the will of an Arab government and the will of the people. And so her question is, when it comes to peace with Israel, Arab nations that have a conflict between the will of the government and the will of the people, sometimes in one direction and sometimes in another. In other words, it may be that the government wants to reach a peace agreement with Israel, but the people who buy into all of the propaganda don't. So when there is such internal conflicts in Arab countries, how does that complicate the prospect for peace with these potential Arab countries like Saudi Arabia or Iraq?
Yeah, let me say it's true. There is a kind of a conflict here, unfortunately, between leaders and nations. No doubt about it. But in the meantime, who is the one who incited those Arab nations against Israel? They are the leaders. They are the leaders who incited against Israel in the past 70 years. 70 years. You know, I used to say that Arab leaders, by mentioning the liberation of the Palestinians from the Israeli occupation, that's a very good umbrella for those leaders to continue corrupting their people politically and financially. That's the problem. I think the one who planned the hatred among the Arab nations towards Israel are their own leaders. And those leaders, looks like these days, are suffering from that. Now, the leaders couldn't at all come to their nations asking them to support Israel. Why? Because you are the one who incite me against Israel. He tried to find another person to come to me and to convince me to support Israel. On the other side, if we will take Egypt as an example, you know, Egypt since 1979 signed a peace accord with Israel. The one who signed the peace accord assassinated by his own people. Then Hosni Mubarak came to power for 30 years. 30 years. You know, in Egypt, there is a huge Christian Coptis community. Those Christian Coptis has a lot of their own properties, holy properties in Israel. When these people try to come on a visit for pilgrims, as an example, to Israel, the Egyptian government refused to allow them to come to Israel. Why you refuse them to come to Israel? Excuse me, you already made a peace accord with Israel. We are going for a religious reasons, not for a political reasons. We are not going to demonstrate in Israel. We are going to pray in Israel. We want to visit our holy places over there. That's really something unbelievable, man. That's really unbelievable. Now, when you take, when we jump from Hosni Mubarak to Abdul Fattah al-Sisi, the current Egyptian president, the current Egyptian president has a very open mind. He realized that Israel only can benefit Egypt. Israel don't want to harass Egypt. Israel don't want to cause any damage to Egypt. And Abdul Fattah al-Sisi realized that Israel can benefit Egypt, and he opened the way these days for any resident or any Egyptian citizen who want to visit Israel. He is allowed to do so. He is allowed to do so. Now, in such way that Abdul Fattah al-Sisi is taking, in my opinion, that's probably will encourage people more and more to be much more open-minded towards Israel. And I think that is such kind of visits from the Arab nations to Israel, that's probably will really bring more and more security, let's say, for the people in the Middle East.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Leslie, you had your hand up, and then afterwards, Alana.
Yeah, thank you, Bassem. This has been really an excellent series. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm curious who you're going to be speaking to at Berkeley and who invited you, because I just have the feeling that there are a lot of Jewish professors there who, feel that Israel, or any professors, is an apartheid state. And they seem to generally, including the Jewish kids, be very, very anti-Israel on that campus. So I hope you have plenty of security that you're going with.
Right. This is not my first time in Berkeley University. I already appeared in Berkeley University several times. I used to have, a kind of confrontation, let's say, with those who consider themselves as a BDS movement. And we used to argue. But I am a person who is telling the students since the beginning that I am here not representing anybody around the world. I came as a person who is living in the heart of the conflict. I am not here to convince any of you. I am here to bring the facts from the ground and to present it to you. Either you accept it or you reject it. You have no right to attack me. You have no right to argue with me. And this is why I used to appear in the universities only with the presence of a uniformed police, not even the security of the university. Uniformed police, 2 policemen with their uniform should have to be inside the room where I am lecturing over there. So I believe that the event, the coming event, which will take place on the 9th of November in Berkeley, of course, I am going, the main topic is the BDS and how is the BDS causing damage to the Palestinians and to the Palestinian economy. And I really hope that the organizers already realize what exactly my demands here. And I hope that this event will go smoothly without, any internal fights, let's say, between me and them.
I do too. And yeah, I wish you luck. I'd
Thank
love to
you.
hear a recording of the session if that was possible.
Thank you. I think that they will record it.
And one other thing, as far as
Yes.
the current administration, I mean, I just see no hope that they will encourage the Abraham Accords. I hope that they don't do anything to harm the Accords, but it seems that they are very much interested in siding with Iran at this point.
Yeah,
So
you know,
what do you suggest we can do,
yeah.
if anything?
See, I think that each American administration has its own political agenda, and it's very difficult to change the political agenda that they are functioning according to it. It's very difficult to change it because the agenda is already on the table at the White House, and everybody should have to obey the agenda which is on the table. I agree with you that there is a huge difference here between the two different administrations, the past one and the current one. The past one was completely different than the current one. The past one has a different agenda. The current one has a different agenda. I agree with you that the current American administration is trying much more to focus on Iran rather than to focus on the Middle East. But in the meantime, we can see also the big failure of the current American administration when they withdrew from Afghanistan. Afghanistan now is going to be the castle of terror in the world. And looks like the current American administration didn't realize yet how terrorist the Taliban is and how terror the Taliban is going to spread around the world. I think that this is one of the biggest fault that they already did, and I hope that they will learn from such a huge mistake that they already made it. Now, on the other side, I think that it is the job of Israel right now and the other Arab countries who signed the Abraham's Accord. This is our job here. We shouldn't have to lay on the Americans. We shouldn't have to lay on the Europeans. We have to do our work in our own hands, in our own efforts. I think that Israel and some Arab countries, especially the United Arab Emirates, knows exactly what they should have to do and how to pull in the Abraham's Accord more and more Arab countries. I can see the full cooperation these days between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, between Israel and the Kingdom of Bahrain, and I believe that that's cooperation will benefit the Israelis and will benefit the Abraham's Accord itself.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So
Thank you.
Alana,
Thank you.
and then after Alana, there's a question by Shan, which we'll read in the chat, but go ahead, Alana.
Yeah.
Mr. Eid, thank you very much. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned earlier about the apartheid movement in South Africa. They don't have a slogan that is working for the Palestinians or the Israelis. And I wondered if you could put you on the spot, if you could come up with a slogan that you think might work, since I think PR and marketing is so poor by everyone. What would be a slogan that might capture people's imagination and be positive for both sides?
I think, in my opinion, if I want to use a slogan today to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I will say, a free Gaza from Hamas. I think that that's the best slogan that the world can help the Palestinians on it. When we are looking today what is going inside Gaza and how the Hamas using 2 million innocent people as hostages in the Gaza Strip, as a human shield in the Gaza Strip, looks like to me that the world has a completely blind eyes. The world is not really looking to the facts on the ground. I think what is going on in Gaza is horrible. And if anyone really want to help the Palestinians, he should have to focus on the Gaza Strip. We are not talking about a small city or small village in Gaza. We are talking about a district which has 2 million people. And if you really want to help the Palestinians, call free Gaza from the Hamas. That's the best slogan for the 21st century that everybody should have to repeat it million times a day. I wish that the world will wake up one day and will start looking to inside Gaza and they try really to save those 2 million Palestinians from the aggression of the Hamas regime in the Gaza Strip.
Thank you.
Before we
Thank
get to
you.
the question of Shan, just to
Yeah.
follow up on your comment about Gaza and Hamas. So we understand that and you talked about this a few minutes ago, Egypt is playing a significant role in
Right.
trying to manage Hamas. What likelihood is there that Egypt can get other Arab countries to support its efforts to try to rein in and control Hamas so that Hamas does not enter into and engage in another war with
Yeah.
Israel?
I think that Egypt already supported by several countries in their involvement in the Gaza Strip. Saudi Arabia completely supporting the Egyptian efforts. United Arab Emirates completely supported the Egyptian efforts. Egypt is acting, you know, from a very strong back. And that back came from those important countries and rich countries like the Saudi Arabia, like United Arab Emirates, like a Kingdom of Bahrain, as an example. I think that Egypt can play a very important role here between Israel and the Hamas. I should have to tell you that in July this year, I was on a trip in Seattle, in Washington State. And one of the events that I got in Seattle, I met 5 opinion columnists in the newspaper called Seattle Times. And you know, to meet with journalists, it's very important because, you know, sometimes media has a completely different side than what I am talking about. Not all of the media agree with me, and I believe that the majority of the media disagree with me. So it was fantastic for me to meet those, you know, editors of opinions in the Seattle Times. Now we talk a little bit about the influence of Egypt on the Hamas and Israel. And the editor of the newspaper found this topic very interesting topic, and he asked me if I want to write an article about the Egypt between Hamas and Israel. It is very interesting. I wrote the article, and the article was published, I believe, 1.5 months ago. And a lot of reactions came on that article. I believe that Egypt can play a very important role here. And I believe that the current Israeli Prime Minister, Mr. Naftali Bennett, and the President of Egypt, Abdel Fattah Sisi, they already met and they already coordinate a lot of things here, not only between Israel and Egypt, but also between Israel and the Hamas. Israel, Egypt is trying to push Israel more and more towards an economic prosperity for the Gaza Strip. Just 3 days ago, we heard that Israel is going to allow for 10,000 Palestinian workers from Gaza to enter to work in Israel. This has never happened since 2005. You know, never happened. And that's because the pressure of Egypt, because Egypt believes if Israel will increase the economy of Gaza, that's probably will decrease the violence of Hamas. And I think that this is something which has already been coordinated between Egypt and Hamas itself. And I think that Egypt right now is playing a very important role between Israel and Hamas. And I believe that the Israeli government is so satisfied from the role that Egypt is playing between the Hamas and Israel.
Thank you. So
Thank you.
Shan had a question a few minutes ago, and it was a question as a human rights activist and as a journalist.
Please.
The question is, what power do you have to access our current administration? Are there ways in which you can speak to people in the Biden administration in order to help perhaps influence the conversation in a different direction?
You know, I wish that I would be invited once to the White House and to speak personally to Mr. Joe Biden and his advisors and his administration. But in my opinion, we are far away to approach a such kind of meeting. But in the meantime, I am visiting, you know, very often the Capitol Hill. And in the Capitol Hill, I am meeting a lot of congressmen over there. I must have to say that the majority of the congressmen I am meeting, they are from the Republicans rather than they are from the Democrats. I wish to have more and more connections with the Democrats that I can, you know, approach them and open their eyes towards the facts on the ground on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But in the meantime, you know, the message that I am spreading here for the communities, for the synagogues, for the campuses, for the students, it is the same message that I am trying to present in front of the representatives in the Capitol Hill to make them more aware about the real needs of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I used to say that by calling two-state solution, that will never solve the conflict. But if you will call for economic prosperity, that's probably will lead to a future solution between the Israelis and the Palestinians. So I think that I am trying to do, you know, the best that I can in terms to spread out more and more the message that I got and to try, you know, to put influence on the policymakers, which is really very important because those people, the policymakers, they are probably will able to bring for some positive changes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Thank you. Ziggy.
So obviously, it's very refreshing to hear the Palestinian espouse these very progressive ideas, which are very absolutely wonderful. So I have twofold question, Mr. Eid.
Please.
Are there many other Palestinians out there which are performed this very, very important function? And if not, why not?
Yeah, let me say that there are a lot. I am living here. I am meeting with people. I know how much Palestinians are meeting with Israelis in a very secret places. Secret places. Why secret places? Because those Palestinians are very scared from the Palestinian Authority itself. You know, I must have to tell you, last year, the mayor of Efrat settlement in Gush Etzion invited 5 Palestinians from different small villages nearby Efrat settlement for Hanukkah, to come and to eat sufganiyot. You couldn't believe that on the next day, those 5 Palestinians has been arrested by the Palestinian Authority. So the problem is that the Palestinian Authority is against any kind of cooperation between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And that's really very sad, because without cooperation between the Israelis and the Palestinians, we would never be able to reach any kind of a future peace here. This is what the Palestinian Authority don't want to understand. And the Palestinian Authority want each Palestinian to stand up with the Palestinian Authority, just fighting and attacking Israel. They don't want to see any one Palestinian who became friendly to any Israeli. And that's the tragedy, in my opinion, of the Palestinians. So there are a lot of people who are in touch with the Israelis, but in a secret way. Because they are scared. Nothing from the Palestinian Authority encouraging these people for any future cooperation with the Israelis. So I believe that there are thousands of Palestinians who would love to be free tomorrow morning and to express their opinions. I believe that they might talk much more than myself.
So to that end, as a final question, do you ever fear your life? Here you are speaking so openly about your frustrations and anger at the Palestinian Authority, and you live in Jerusalem. How does that, towards you, do you always feel safe, or do you feel, in fact, that your life is in danger?
You know, all the time, Richard, I used to say that I am feeling more safe in Jerusalem rather than in New York or Los Angeles, because I really feeling the Israeli conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in LA and in New York much more than in between Ramallah and Jerusalem. That's one of the major problems here. Now, secondly, I am very well, I am very safe. You know, Richard, from 2000 till 2014, I used to appear on the Israeli TV weekly in a live program in Arabic. And what I am saying in English here, I repeated millions of times in Arabic for 14 years in a live program on the Israeli TV. People knows me very well. I am moving to everywhere in the West Bank. I have a friend over there. I am invited sometimes to go and to talk with some Palestinians, especially in the refugee camps. And by myself, by the way, myself grown up and developed for 33 years in a refugee camp.
Well, as we say in Tanakh, Chazak ve'amatz.
To that.
May you continue to have strength and courage to speak
Thank
the
you.
truth,
Thank you.
to fight the corruption, and
Right.
to share the possibility of peace between Israelis and Palestinians and Arabs. May there be more like you in the Middle East and in the world.
Yeah.
And it's been a privilege for all of us at Temple Aliyah, at Shomrei Torah Synagogue, and at D Toledo High School to have the honor of listening and learning from you these past 3 weeks. We are very, very grateful, and we hope and pray that we will have future opportunities to learn together, to work together for peace, and to fight for justice here and in the Middle East.
Thank you so much. I would like really to thank Temple Aliyah for this invitation. I really joined these 3 sessions very much, and I want to wish all of you a wonderful night, very safe night. Thank you so much, and all the best from Jerusalem.